Line's good.
Never on!
Whoa.
Hard! Release!
Come on, Brent. Line's good. Got real close.
The hair high, right?
Try and hit 2/3.
Have they saved it for her? Yes, they have.
Ooh, welcome to Game of Stones, everybody. I am Sean Graham. Scott not alongside this week. He is off doing a forensic accounting of his bar bill from this past curling season. I could tell him why it's higher than he might expect, but it's more fun to let him do it on its own. So I am here flying solo, at least temporarily here this week. We're going to do something a little different. We're not going to talk exclusively about curling. We're going to talk about sport in general and a new book by Ian Kennedy entitled On Account of Darkness, Shining Light on Race and Sport. Ian writes for the Hockey News, and he's also written for Yahoo, the Globe and Mail, and other publications. And in this book, what he's done is explored the history of Chatham-Kent in southwestern Ontario and how the region's history of sport is emblematic of broader challenges that have faced non-white athletes across North America. And so he profiles athletes, some of whom are pretty famous, people like Fergie Jenkins, who I think a lot of folks will have heard of, but also some local athletes, people who never made it to whether Major League Baseball, the National Hockey League, the NBA, whatever it is, who didn't make it. He profiles some of their stories to talk about how the systemic discrimination and racism that they faced in sport is representative of larger social challenges, both in the region and across the country. It really is a wonderful book. And given all the discussions in curling around inclusivity and eliminating discrimination within the sport, really wanted to share this discussion on the show this week. And additionally, Monday, the 19th of June, is Juneteenth. It is a federal holiday in the United States commemorating the emancipation of enslaved persons of African descent. So I really did enjoy this discussion. I hope you will as well. So let's get right into my chat with Ian Kennedy. All right, Ian Kennedy joins me now from Chatham-Kent. Ian, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Sean.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for being here. As I said in the intro, the book is On Account of Darkness, and this is your debut book. So Ian, let's get into what the book is about, the history of sports and minorities in Chatham-Kent, and what brought you to this particular topic in the first place.
Well, I've been writing about sports for quite some time. Right now I write for the Hockey News, Yahoo Sports, and a variety of other publications, but it has become such a hot topic in the world of how sports can kind of cross the border into social issues and how there really is no detachment point between those two, and whether that or not that's the ongoing homophobia and transphobia that we seem to be talking about a little bit more right now, or the history of systemic racism and oppression. And being from Chatham-Kent, where we have a rich history of Black settlement, we have two Indigenous communities, we had a major role in the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II. There were so many stories historically that I should have known about as a sports fan and sports writer. And when I started discovering them, every single day I would research, interview, whatever it might have been, and left that talk or that day going, I had no idea that this famous athlete, this influential person, this event was connected to my community. And I should have known that, and I didn't. And so I approached it from a not a storyteller's standpoint, but from a story preservationist, from a history preservationist approach. And then through that process, really started tying it to those social issues and making personal connections and community connections. But it was a pandemic project, it was something when the time presented itself, it came to be. It was kind of fate how I actually got the publishing deal. I was sitting in the Black History Museum here in Chatham, Kent, and a publishing company just happened to reach out to Tidewater Press about wondering if there was anyone writing about the Chatham Colored All-Stars baseball team that is so famous for their 1934 history. But that was, I was just sitting there researching the exact team and people that were involved with it when that came through. And, a little over a year later, here we are.
Yeah, so that works out really well. You love when those things are very serendipitous like that. But before we get into some of the specific teams, let's talk about Chatham Kent a little bit. It's a place I've spent some time in my life, mostly on baseball tournaments as a kid. Wheels In was super fun when I was a kid out there in Chatham. And I associate it kind of on that line between where you'll see like Blue Jays hats and Tigers hats down there in Southwest Ontario, kind of on that breaking point to a certain extent, but also a little bit of Canada's Tobacco Road of sorts. And certainly the history of it, the popular history of it, is that it was a terminus of the Underground Railroad during the slavery period in the United States. So what is the community there like, and what is the historical presence of everything from that 19th century era that I think if people know Chatham Kent, that's probably what they best know it for?
Yeah, so there is a number of things that we would be known for. Of course, agriculture is the biggest one. So your Tobacco Road, we are probably the leading producers of tomatoes, carrots, Brussels sprouts. You could name it. And in Canada, or North America wide, we are probably one of the number one producers of those. But in terms of the Underground Railroad, you are correct that we had not just one, but two major sites here, which turned into three settlements, plus a little bit here and there. But the main one being the Don settlement that has gone down, historically, which was formerly called Uncle Tom's Cabin, but we now have renamed that here because of the racist connotations that come along just with that term and stereotype, after Josiah Henson, who was the founder of that community. And we also had the Elgin settlement, which is located at Buxton community here, which we have the Buxton National Historic Monument and Site and Museum as well. So those were two very prominent places, but Chatham Kent also was essential in the organization of resistance and of, freedom seekers. The raid on Harper's Ferry, which is considered one of the first battles of the Civil War, was planned in Chatham. It was, occurred here with John Brown and many of the other freedom seekers and allies and people that were working to emancipate enslaved people. So that, those historical connections run so deep, and I could list a dozen of them for you that if you were a late 1800s, early 1900s historic Black figure, you probably were here at some point. Frederick Douglass and people like that you were probably involved in Chatham Kent at some point. Also, we have a vast history of some of the Indigenous topics that were here, whether that was Chief Tecumseh, who was a major figure in the War of 1812, and whether or not Black Hawk, people like that were so important in fighting those battles and working to have Indigenous sovereignty still in place. It all happened here in Chatham Kent. So in terms of how that connected to the book, it was an example in some ways of not just the history, but the context surrounding the history. Because as much as we praise Chatham Kent for being this spot of Black settlement and where a lot of that anti-slavery work happened, there was immense resistance to Black settlement here. And there was immense racism toward Indigenous people here. And we had 5 Japanese internment camps here during World War II. And we are kind of a microcosm of Canada as a whole, where we present ourselves as one thing, but the facts the context around it are quite different when you look at it, that we played such a role in upholding those oppressive barriers, not just breaking them down. And Canada, we present ourselves as this all welcoming, all encompassing country where we don't have the same problems that exist, about 45 minutes away from Chatham, Kent in the United States. But we do have all of those things, and we have had all of those things. And that's what I tried to show in the book through the lens of sport, while, recapping all of these major historical figures and incidents, because at one time or another, they all do have sporting connections. Whether it's Josiah Henson, who founded the Don Settlement, he loved horse racing and breeding horses for that purpose. And some of the race horses that he bred are the direct lines and lineage of the most famous horses that are out there. So there's connections to all of it. And I found it fascinating doing that and seeing, not just the history, but how it all tied to every aspect of life, including sport.
Well, so let's get into sport and how sport plays into some of these discussions. One of the things that I've been entertained by over the past 3-4 years is more and more athletes are using their platforms to talk about social issues, is the pushback saying that we have to get back to when sports was apolitical. And I just think of, yes, all those very apolitical athletes like Jesse Owens, Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, who were only known for what they did in their sport and nothing outside of sport at all. So the argument that sports has been apolitical doesn't necessarily hold up to any sort of reality. But how does sport play out specifically within Chatham, Kent, within these communities, and addressing, broadly speaking, some of the larger societal issues that you were talking about?
Well, absolutely. The sport has not just been political, but it actually has been weaponized at times to push the agendas or the policies or to uphold those barriers. And in Chatham, Kent, a lot of that, we had some of the very earliest Black athletes that made significant contributions. Our first ever recorded organized baseball game in Chatham, Kent was in 1871, and it featured an all-Black baseball team. And that history in Chatham, Kent has moved forward through teams like that prominent Chatham Colored All-Stars, who were the first ever all-Black baseball team, and I believe the only all-Black baseball team ever to win a provincial championship in Canada, which they did in 1934 at a time when racism was absolutely rampant everywhere in Canada. There really was no way to disconnect that there. But they represented so much in terms of the way that sport can be used to bridge barriers, because people looked at Chatham and the Chatham All-Stars as representatives of the community, but also the inequities where when they won that championship, they came back to Chatham, were paraded down the main street, but the next day were unable to access any of the businesses or restaurants or hotels on that main street. So it's really, there's so many portions of that represent our history. Dresden, Ontario, being where Josiah Henson founded the Don Settlement, was actually a location where much of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the issues that surfaced there with people being refused service because they were Black, surrounded in that community. That's where many of those fights happened. You can go back into historical magazines and newspapers and find that, in the 1950s, after it was banned that people could not discriminate based on race, Dresden continued to do that. And, the headlines read, "Jim Crow lives here," and things like that in Dresden. And it almost always still circles around to people that played sports and tried to break those barriers through sport. Unsuccessfully at times, but many of our prominent athletes here in Chatham, Kent, have those lines, the lineage from the Chatham Colored All-Stars in 1934. There was a man named Ferguson Jenkins Sr., who his son obviously is Fergie Jenkins, who was the first ever Canadian inducted to the Canadian Baseball Hall of, or the Baseball Hall of Fame, not just the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. Famed, had a statue of himself erected outside of Wrigley Field in Chicago this year. we have just so many. Ed Penance, who was a baseball player from Walpole Island First Nation here that borders our community, was often considered the first Indigenous baseball player in the major leagues. There's debate around that because of a racist term called blood quantum that would say that he was only the first full-blooded Indigenous person, which is, of course, in itself a horrific way to refer to any human being.
Yeah.
Jackie Robinson, he obviously broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball, but he probably wouldn't have been able to do that without a man named Wendell Smith, who is a sports writer from Pittsburgh, whose father grew up here in just outside of Dresden, and then became the personal chef of Henry Ford, bringing his family to the United States, where Wendell wanted to play baseball, was a great baseball player, and of course heard the same kind of feedback that if his skin color were different, he would have been a major leaguer as well. And so much of the resistance that we've seen to racism, to oppression, to those barriers that existed was fought by people that had roots here. And there's a lot of pride in that in our community that we have that, but also all of those people faced immense levels of racism. I could throw out many of the names that are in this book. Vicky Sunahara, who was a Canadian Olympian, gold medalist, world champion. Her father lived here in Blenheim, which is a smaller community in Chatham-Kent. Bob Azumi, who's probably the most famous Canadian fisherman of all time. Yeah. His father was here, and his father found this community by being sent here to work building roads in Rondo Provincial Park as part of being a Japanese Canadian that was interned. And, Bob grew up here as well and faced all of those, the same racist stereotypes and, being called names and having to overcome those things to be where he is. But there are so many connections to this area that represent Canada as a whole. And that's why I think, most people, if you ask them where Chatham-Kent was on a map, they would never be able to give you that answer. But the historical significance of this portion of Canada has really been overlooked in terms of social progress, in terms of the history of racism in Canada, and in terms of athletic history as well.
So what is it about sports do you think allows for there to be such a prominent place for moving on these social issues, addressing things like racism and discrimination? Now, one of the theories that often gets thrown out is that ideally sports is entirely merit-based, that when you're in a competitive environment at the highest levels, if you're Jackie Robinson and you can hit, and you can't really hide that. And once people are given an opportunity and it becomes merit-based, then they prove that, well, I'm a really good athlete, and it becomes an environment where discrimination can be openly challenged. Do you buy into that theory that sports being competitive on the field, you can plainly see who wins, who loses, who's better than somebody else, that level of competition, that type of competition, which is different from, say, economic competition, where it's not necessarily all out there on an even playing field. Do you buy into that theory, or do you have some other explanation for why sports has historically been such an important place to have these types of discriminatory practices challenged openly?
Well, I think that sports has been driven by economics and finances forever. So if an owner sees that there's an opportunity for a competitive advantage, then they might be willing to break some of those barriers. But it's a false narrative that, merit-based success exists. And I'll give you an example. One of the baseball players from that 1934 Colored All-Stars, his name was Wilfred Boomer Harding. And he was not just a great baseball player, but he was an excellent hockey player as well. And in 1946, he had been deployed in World War II, and he ended up playing hockey in Europe with many members of the Detroit Red Wings, Montreal Canadiens, New York Rangers on this touring army team. And when he came back, one of the players from the Detroit Red Wings recommended him to the organization. So they decided that they were going to sign him to this Detroit Auto Club, which was a farm team for the Red Wings. when they found out he was black, they immediately traded him to the Windsor Staffords. And on that team, uh, Boomer was not only a groundbreaker, but uh, he also faced many barriers as well. 2 years before that, in 1944, he tried to go to Detroit's Olympia Stadium, which was the home of the Red Wings at the time, and he wanted to go public skating with his family, and was told that public meant white, and they were turned away. And there's many of those stereotypes around Black people, related to hockey, related to swimming, that they're unable. And it's not that they're unable. That is so false that I think we can all understand that. It's that the access to sport was restricted. If you can't go to an arena, if you can't go to a public pool, if you can't swim at a public beach, uh, you can't learn those skills, and you can't pass those skills generationally to your children and your grandchildren. And so that's why we see a historic lack of representation in those types of sports, regardless of ability. So Boomer Harding played one season for the Windsor Staffords. He found out very quickly after scoring 2 goals in his first games that he would never be allowed to score a hat trick, because the owner of that club at the time gave a fancy fedora, the big hats, to anyone on the team that scored a hat trick. And every time that Boomer scored 2 goals in a game, he was benched for the remainder of the game and never saw the ice again. So he finished, I think, third or something like that on the team, never being able to score. He would only try and score in the third period, because if he got benched at that point, he was missing a minimal portion of the game.
Right.
So sport has open doors for people like Ferguson Jenkins that came out of here. He was a revered athlete in Chatham-Kent. He faced, in his own recollection, very little racism in Chatham until he went to the United States and then faced significant racism. So he was one of those people that kind of used sport to overcome.
Right.
But traditionally, that was not the case. And sport, as I said, has been used as a weapon. The one historical example I love to give to people when I'm talking about this is at residential schools, where the introduction of hockey was used to make Indigenous youth feel more Canadian. And I can use air quotes when I say feel more Canadian, because I don't know what that means.
Mm-hmm.
But to strip the traditional sports and games and identity that was held in Indigenous communities, and to make them feel quintessentially Canadian through the most Canadian thing that we have at times, which is hockey. So there's both sides to that debate, which you brought up. Merit-based, absolutely. Even the Chatham Colored All-Stars, when they made the provincial championships for playoffs, they dropped the term colored from their name, and they went by the Chatham All-Stars to attempt to fool or surprise people until they actually showed up on the baseball diamond to play, that they were an all-black baseball team.
Wow. Yeah. And in terms of because you mentioned the residential schools, another interesting story for that, it's not Chatham-Kent, but Fred Saskamoose. His story is in line with that. To a certain extent, he had a pretty successful career, but one of the things that comes out in his story is that the residential school where he was using the team's success to show the community that, hey, look at what we're doing. They used it almost promotionally. Yeah. The idea of weaponizing sport, for sure. It comes up a lot. And it does raise the question with respect to the book and the athletes that you're looking at. Is there a difference that you've noticed in the profiles of the type of sports? So baseball, early 20th century, arguably the most important sport in North America. Is there a more prominent role for athletes in that sport versus some of the more niche sports, if you will? And as things change and some sports become more popular, others potentially less popular, does that impact the role of those athletes that you're profiling, basically the general interest in the sports that they're playing?
Well, the book itself features a wide spread of sports, from horse racing to swimming to cricket to hockey to baseball to lacrosse. It's all there. And originally, as we're talking about crossing into the 1900s, a sport like cricket was actually probably the most prominent, well-played, popularized sport that existed, at least in Ontario. But we had a Canadian national team that was doing very well, and players from this area were going to that. But at the time, cricket was seen as a gentleman's game. And if you can read between, the lines of what that meant, it meant English upper class, wealthy, white. And there are newspaper articles after newspaper articles from our area at the time that when baseball started to become a game here, it was referred to as the degenerates game.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned earlier, the first ever recorded baseball game in our community in 1871 was played by an all black baseball team. And so that battle line was formed very quickly between a number of sports. And horse racing here was a surprising one that was had a very prominent black history. Our Dresden Raceway, that still exists to this day, has started holding a Black History event once a year to honor those families and those racers. But again, those were the types of sports, along with boxing, that at that time were used quite often on plantations by slave owners. They would use those sports for entertainment. And one of the people in the book, a man named Arthur Pelkey, who was a boxer here, was a champion. And at one point in time, he was referred to as the Great White Hope. And that meant that his job was to vanquish the best boxer in the world, Jack Johnson, who was a black man, and to claim the sport back for white people. And, we've probably heard, so a lot of people have probably heard that term, Great White Hope, and have no idea what it actually means, but it's tied to boxing in the early 1900s. And again, just kind of that, the divide between different sports. And then boxing was used prominently as a spot of protest, whether it was Joe Louis or Muhammad Ali. Baseball, we saw it through, Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby, and even the all black baseball leagues that existed in teams. It was a more accessible sport because you could play it just about anywhere, much like soccer nowadays, compared to hockey, where lots of facilities were needed. And lacrosse being another one with that lacrosse was actually claimed by white Canadians as our national sport, is in an attempt to fill vacant arenas as arenas moved indoors in the summer months, and really appropriated that game that never existed indoors, was never an indoor game to be played for competitive nature. It was really considered the creator's game, a medicine that was a healing, cultural, community-based game. So, and now it's being reclaimed by different nations that are hosting their own national teams, because of course we refer to First Nations as nations. And so those groups are using sport now as protest to bring back the roots of it and to tie it to culture again, and to reclaim not just sport, but historical culture around the significance of the game. And so it's hard to overlook things like baseball versus cricket. I know you're a curling fan, and again, another indoor ice game, wasn't originally, but was definitely, a prominently white sport, based on the where it originated and who played it and for what purposes it was played. And all of those things tie together very tightly. So yeah, there's no disconnect between those developments and sport.
Yeah. And the boxing example is very interesting. So the professionalization of boxing around the turn of the 20th century. And you could throw Larry Gaines from Toronto into the list that you threw out as well, of kind of prominent individuals who weren't quite given a chance to compete at the highest level. So yeah, boxing is a great case study, great example. Certainly, as you said, great examples in hockey and baseball as well. So you mentioned that there's a lot of athletes here. You've mentioned a bunch already. Is there one story that surprised you, that a person who you didn't know about what their journey was, what their story was, that really, because I think some people, at least people who've grown up and been around Southern Ontario, may have heard of the Chatham Colored All-Stars. I think most baseball fans would have at least heard of Fergie Jenkins. But is there one that really surprised you as somebody who's from the area and was doing this research on the All-Stars originally, like just one story or a bunch of stories perhaps that really stood out to you as being surprising?
There are so many. One that really sticks out to me, not a person that was born in Chatham, Kent, but a person that played here for the Chatham Maroons was a man named George Chin. And in 1944, George and his brothers were invited to try out for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Obviously, George was a Chinese Canadian. He was one of like 11 family members from Lucknow, Ontario. And he was a fabulous hockey player. By all rights, everyone at the Toronto Maple Leafs tryouts, which happened in Owen Sound that year, thought that he was skill-wise very capable of playing in the league. And of course, he didn't. That took 4 more years for the first person of color to play in the National Hockey League. But he had a larger cultural impact than I think many people know. And that came through a man named Paul Henderson, who, of course, scored that famous 1972 Summit Series goal. But Paul Henderson also grew up in Lucknow, and he was coached by the Chin family through his entire childhood. And the Chin family gave Paul Henderson his first ever set of hockey equipment. And in the basement of the Chin's family restaurant in Lucknow, Ontario, the floor would flood, and in the winter months it would freeze, and kids would go down there and work on their hockey skills. And that is where Paul Henderson found his love for the game of hockey. And without the Chin family, who we don't know anything about, most people, if you said the name George Chin, there would be a tiny handful of people that would ever be able to place that. Paul Henderson might not have been Paul Henderson that we know. Yeah. And so George Chin, though, did go on to play, some successful hockey. He's considered one of the best ever to play for the University of Michigan in the NCAA level. But that's one. The other one is a much more niche name or person, I guess, that a man named Bill Sands, who I met here. And I only knew of Bill because I had read that he was taken to the Mohawk Institute Residential School, an Indigenous man from Walpole Island First Nation. And as I got to know him, it turned out that he's probably one of the most legendary hunting and fishing guides that there, he's led duck hunting trips for several presidents, prime ministers, Cher, Ted Nugent, Gordie Howe, Alex Delvecchio, Bobby Orr. If you wanted to find a person in the world that wanted to hunt or fish, they've probably been with Bill at some point. But his story took me through so many different levels, being from Wallaceburg, Ontario, which was my hometown, and a very racist community towards Indigenous people because we shared schools with people from Walpole Island First Nation. And talking to Bill about his residential school experience where he played hockey and the only entertainment that they got was sport, and that he got to watch once a week Hockey Night in Canada, again, to, show the Canadian culture. But then through his childhood where he raced these Indigenous spirit horses, which almost went extinct and are now coming back. And I got to go with Bill and walk through the bush on Walpole Island First Nation and learn from him and connect to him in that way. And it was a really powerful experience for me. And I think that's a portion of history that I came to love, because I'm not a nonfiction reader. I was never really wanted to be a nonfiction writer. But when I interacted with the people and heard the oral history and had the opportunity to keep the oral history alive and feel the nuance and the emotion and see the tears running down someone's face as they recalled history, it really brought it to meaning and to life for me. And so for my self-learning, Bill will always hold a very crucial point in that journey for myself of finding out, like I said, not just remembering the dates and the stats and the facts, but knowing that because of this and because of this, we now have this system of government, or we have this system of policy, or, we've changed in this way and society has evolved because of this. And those points for me, I just can't overlook. And it was his story that if anyone does pick up the book, I think you'll be impacted by it as well, because it was very raw and real, and his recollection was very vivid of the things he was able to recall. And, those, the tiniest moments, whether it was him carving his name on a brick behind the Mohawk Institute, um, just in the book, I feel like they hold people. And it might not seem, when I say that right now, it might not seem significant at all. But if you read the passages that involve that emotion that he felt doing that, it is significant. And I think that's, other than the big stories of people like the Paul Hendersons and how they tie into this all, those things stick with you, and that micro history, not just the big Jackie Robinsons of the world, but the people in their local levels, the micro stories of these small communities that created these trickle effects of Dresden, Ontario being this quintessential spot in the rights that we all enjoy in Canada. People don't know those things. And there's a great importance for understanding why we got to these points, so that we don't repeat. The
Right.
history repeats itself, but we don't want this exact case to do that.
Yeah. And that's too one of the beautiful things about sports too, is that, there's the guys out there who are making $50 million a year playing, sure, but that does not represent even close to the majority of sports or what the power of sport is. Really, the majority of it is people just going out and playing and building community on their own. But it does lead to this question. I'll get you out of here on this. You write about sports. This is what you do. And one of the things that I've had sports writers tell me before, they don't care who wins, they don't care who loses, they care for a good story and a fast game, and that's really all they care about. But for you, like, how does this shape the way you now look at sports? Has going through this process, doing this research, writing this book, has that influenced the way you think about, write about contemporary sports and the significance of the games on the ice and what happens off the ice? Has this really reframed your career to a certain extent?
Absolutely. When I started sports writing, it was reporting the games and the successes and things. And over time, I developed a much more critical lens, where I recognize the power that these games have to distract us from big issues, to be a platform to talk about big issues, where we see the racist oppression that might occur, whether or not it's, something like the murder of George Floyd, echoed throughout sport, where we see protest afterwards. The Colin Kaepernicks of the world, that system, what Kaepernick did there could be echoed by the Muhammad Alis of the world, and many of those people that we talk about that are historic figures. But also, it's echoed by the Chatham Colored All-Stars and what they did, and their ability to overcome oppression. And that's in the title of the book itself. On Account of Darkness comes from the fact that in that championship game, they were about 2 outs away from winning the provincial title. And at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, the umpires put their hands in the air and called the game on account of darkness. And if you hear the recollections of the players afterwards and their family members, they'll tell you very clearly that the only fact that it was too dark, the only reason it was too dark on the baseball field was because there was 9 black baseball players on the field. It was very much still daylight. And, so when we look at what's going on in sport today, when we look at the gaps between the racism that we see in hockey, let's say, it's tied to the fact that arenas were segregated. It's tied to the fact that, in swimming, that pools were segregated. And we can't separate those items today and just ignore them and tell people to stick to sports, because there are real human beings playing those games, and those games have a real cultural and societal impact on how we view issues, whether or not athletes stand up and use their platforms to discuss those issues, or whether or not, as the term might be nowadays, we are sport washing history.
Right. And that's a very well said and a very good reason to go check out the book. It is On Account of Darkness, Shining Light on Race and Sport. As you said, it looks at athletes from the Chatham-Kent region, but certainly touches on issues that are broader than just within the community and things that go on around the world, really. So, Ian, if people want to get a copy of the book, what's the best way for them to do so and to keep up with all the other writing that you got going on?
Well, you can, of course, order it right through my publishing company, tidewaterpress.ca, if you want to support an independent Canadian company, but you can also buy it from online at Indigo or Chapters, Amazon, just about anywhere you get your books. You can walk into your local bookstore, and if they don't have it on their shelves, they can order it in for you. Anywhere that you want to get them, you can get them. In terms of my own writing, you're probably best to follow me on Twitter if you have it at Ian Kennedy CK, or you can read the Hockey News. I'm now running a brand new arm of the Hockey News called the Hockey News Women's, which we are only writing about women's hockey to try and break another one of those barriers that exists, which is, of course, that gender barrier that's out there too. But that's my main spot. You can find some of my more critical articles with Yahoo Sports, the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, The Guardian. You can look them up, and you're going to find something where I've discussed one of these issues ongoing.
So with respect to the Hockey News and the women, we'll get this in real quick. Is the United States against Canada in women's hockey the best rivalry in sports? Like, because I honestly can't think of one that is like a longer term, more heated. Like, it's 25 years at this point that they're the best two teams and really go at each other when they play. So I can't think of a better one.
It is amazing to watch. I was at the World Championships this year in Brampton, Ontario, and watching those games played, you really don't know what's going to happen until the dying minutes of any game. It is a coin toss every single time, and the emotions are so high, the tenseness that you can just feel in the arena from every single person there. It's an edge of your seat game. But the really exciting portion of that is that the other countries are coming, and we can now see through the growth of professional women's hockey and NCAA and U Sports hockey that they are coming. Czechia this year won their second consecutive bronze and gave some really tough games to those two teams. Sweden took Canada to overtime. It is coming, and that sport is growing. But currently, I cannot think of a better one myself, that year after year is just this nail biter game that nobody can predict, and it's flip flopped every year. So, my opinion, yeah, definitely the best rivalry in sports.
Yeah, it's just must watch when it comes on at the World Championship and certainly at the Olympics as well. So check all that out. We will link to everything down in the show notes, to the book, to Ian's Twitter, to the Hockey News as well. So check it all out. Ian Kennedy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Sean.
So there you have it, my chat with Ian Kennedy, again, on account of darkness, shining light on race and sport. I thank him for joining me. If you want to check it out, certainly would encourage you to do it. As I said off the top, the issues that he addresses, none are curling specific, but some of the broader themes within the book and within that discussion certainly apply to the sport of curling and the discussions that we've had on the show, and certainly are going on broadly across the sport. So very relevant to our sport, again, even though none of the athletes specifically in the book are curlers. So definitely encourage you to check that out and check out Ian's other work as well. And also, as I mentioned, Monday, the 19th, is Juneteenth. So if it's a holiday that you are not familiar with, it is new as an official national holiday in the United States. We'll put a couple links down in the show notes about the history of Juneteenth and its significance. So be sure to check that out. And with that, I will say thank you so much for listening. If you have not yet, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcast, likes, rates, comments, all that good stuff. Helps other people find the show and keeps us growing. You can also head on over to GameOfStonesPod.com. All of our past episodes are available, plus a link to the merch under the merch tab. And you can follow along with everything we got going on social media at Game of Stones Pod, Twitter, Instagram, Game of Stones Podcast on Facebook. And you can always reach out, gameofstonespodcast@gmail.com. So thanks so much for listening, everybody. Scott should be back next week. We'll see what the grand total is. But until that time, keep those brooms on the ice and don't dump that intern.
Make the final.